Adab, welcome to Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities lecture series co-hosted by Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. I'm Nauman Naqvi. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Comparative Humanities here at Habib University in Karachi. This series of ours, Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, follows a series that we did last year, last academic year, 2020 to 2021, which was titled Islam After Colonialism. And that series charted the dramatic transformations under the devastating global impact of modern apartheid colonial rule in the nature of Islam in South Asia. There was more of a South Asia specific series across culture, religion, politics, society, and the arts. This particular series remains within that constellation, but we are focusing more on the spiritual resources. Yeah, and because the term decolonial here comes with the term spiritual, this means that it's spiritual is not something that is unrelated to questions of politics, ethics, history, religion. It puts the two into relation. The reason for this is that there are vast areas of contemporary literacy involving all of these different regions, where the concepts and imaginations of these domains of which I was speaking, religion, very, very significantly, very importantly, politics, ethics, history, all of these are still hostage to that modern apartheid colonial heritage. So this series is more focused on the spiritual and ethical resources that we might reclaim, or that might not even be past, in fact, might be present and not but just might not be visible as a result of our own conceptual limitations. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, who is the director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, to introduce our very distinguished guest today.
Thank you, Nauman. And hello, salam, adab from me as well. It's a pleasure to introduce today Professor Rose Aslan, who is Associate Professor of Global Islam and Religion at California Lutheran University. Rose teaches courses on Islam, including Islamic spirituality, as well as comparative religion. Also, for a number of years, she's been researching the role of sacred space, the body and ritual within Muslim societies and cultures. Recently, for the last year or so, about last year, she's been on sabbatical in Istanbul, where she started a coaching practice called Comparative Flow Coaching, where she draws on her academic background as well as the coaching training, and offers, as she puts it, a unique approach to supporting spiritually oriented women. I'm quite excited by today, quite simply because we're really focusing on the praxis element of what we want to be doing. So in the past, we've looked at the political issues in the background. So really this series is about, moving forward and looking at what the current resources are and what the practices are. So Rose's presentation is called Embodying Our Scholar Selves, Bringing Praxis and Compassion into the Study of Islamic Spirituality. I'm sure we're all very much looking forward to her presentation and looking forward to discussing it after as well. So without any further ado, welcome, Rose, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you, Drs. Naqvi and Rizvi. It's really an honor to be here and to be in this joint adventure between the two universities. So yes, my talk will be about the praxis, and we'll see how we can tie this all in together. This is something new for me, and let me share my screen so you can see my slides. Okay, can you see my slides? Okay. So I'm going to be telling a story more than giving an academic talk. And I told Sajjad this. He wrote me an email a month or two ago and said, would you like to give a talk in this series on decolonial Islamic spiritualities? And I was like, I'd love to hear what your response was, how it affected you. But I told him, well, at the moment, I'm not really working on any academic projects. I am writing a book on the side, but my main focus now is on the well-being of myself and others. And so I told him, I can't give an academic talk. That's not what I'm doing right now, but I can talk about the story I've been on as an academic to finding the meaning of Islamic spiritualities as a teacher, as a researcher, as an academic, and as a human, and what it means really to decolonize ourselves as scholars, scholars of Islam, of Islamic spiritualities, and to bring in our humanity as scholars. This is where the praxis comes out. Now, I'm not proposing we all become Sufis and go join the Mevlevi order and become whirling dervishes. What I'm proposing is that we merge our two selves as academic, as scholars, as researchers, and ourselves as humans. This is something that's been missing in academia, as far as I can tell, since I've been participating in it for the past 2 decades or so. And so I want to tell you my story as a researcher, as an educator, teacher, and as a human. And so this is going to relate to that, in that we really, I believe as scholars, and I hold that we need to learn to not just theorize about Sufism, about spirituality, about the body, about Islam, but we need to actually embody ourselves, embody what it means to teach these topics. It doesn't matter what your faith tradition is, but we need to embody ourselves and to deal with our students and our research topic from a more embodied perspective. So when I watched Cyrus Dargar's talk with this series a couple of weeks ago, I thought it was interesting that Sajjad mentioned, let's talk about the presence and future of decolonial Islamic spiritualities. At first I heard him say presence instead of presence. And I was like, oh yes, let's start with presence. This is how I start everything. And so I wanted to propose we do something a little bit different. Personally, I've never experienced this in an academic context. Maybe some of you have, but I would like to take you through some movements, some somatic awareness of becoming present within our bodies. Because if decolonizing Islamic spiritualities is about our present and the futures, I believe that presence is also part of this. So before I start, I just want to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of the most merciful, the most compassionate. I'm going to lead you through some activities, some movements. They don't adhere to any specific religious tradition, so you can be from any tradition and practice these, because we're going to be practicing sitting with our bodies. And this is because as academics, as scholars, we often forget we have a body. And so I want you to experience your body for a few minutes during this process. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is take your right hand and place it over your heart space, over your chest. And take your left hand and place it over the back of your neck, right below your skull. I just want you to sit and see how that feels. These are two very sensitive parts of the body. The back of the neck is connected to the vagus nerve. This vagus nerve controls our entire nervous system. Often when we feel anxiety, when we feel stress, learning how to be aware of this nervous system, our nervous system, learning how to help it remain calm, remain present is a really powerful tool. Just notice what you're feeling as you touch the back of your neck, your heart space. Let yourself breathe in and out. Notice how you're breathing, if you're breathing shallowly in your chest, or are you breathing deeply in your belly or diaphragm? When you inhale, is your belly going out or is your chest going out? Now you can, at this point, you can put your hands anywhere you like. You can keep them there if you like it, or just place them on your lap. I'm going to take you through a breathing practice. One thing I've really found useful over these past years is something called breath work. It's the practice of being with our breath, which actually has its origin also in the Islamic spiritual context. There's a big tradition of breathing and being aware of our breath. This has nothing to do with Sufism. This is just a practice that can help us gain more awareness of our breath. This particular practice is called box breathing. So we'll just do this for a minute to see how we can be aware of our breathing. Personally, when I practice this, I kind of see this wheel going like this of the breath kind of going in and out and in and out. But it's a cycle, so you can notice the cycle of your breath. And so we're going to breathe and we're going to inhale with our nose. And I'm going to ask you to pause for 5 seconds. We're going to then exhale for 5 seconds. We're going to pause for 5 seconds. So you might often be used to holding after the inhale, but you're going to try also holding after your exhale. So let's inhale from our nose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale through your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now allow yourself to breathe one more round of breath on your own count. At this point, I'm going to ask you to look around the room you're in. Just notice the objects around you, maybe things that bring you joy, pictures, objects, colors. Just notice, and I want you to land your gaze and spend 30 seconds gazing on an object that brings you some joy when you look at it. Brings you good memories, good thoughts. And as you let your gaze go back to the screen, just notice how you feel at this point. Do you feel any different from when we first started, just by taking a few quiet moments to be with yourself, to be with your breath? Observe your body, observe your thoughts. Is your mind busy? Is it quiet? Is your body tense? Is it relaxed? Just notice what's going on. You don't need to add to your list of things in your mind. Just let it, just notice what you're seeing right now, what you're noticing. And as I end this practice, think about after this talk, who you might engage with in your family, in your friend, in your circle of academics. Who would you like to connect with? Who can support you whenever you need? Can you say something kind to them? Can you do something kind for them? That would be easy for you. Just think about that. What can you do to ask for support from someone else? What can you do to offer them a gesture, a word of kindness? Thank you. Now imagine if every academic conference and talk started with this. Would you feel a little bit different at conferences? I know I've been to many conferences where kind of falling asleep a little bit, especially because of jet lag. If I've traveled across time zones, And I love going to conferences and being intellectually stimulated, but it's quite hard to keep up to listen to people give papers all day long because we're human and we only have so much concentration. Imagine if at conferences, at talks, if we're giving these few moments before we started, just to check in with ourselves, to breathe, to feel present in our bodies, because we are humans with bodies who might be academics as well. But I've noticed, and why I'm giving this talk is that academics especially are more disembodied than some other people. And why is this? Why do we need to do things other than theorize? I think theorizing about decolonizing Islamic spirituality is a very important topic, but we also need to embody ourselves and be in the present. Most of us are workaholics in academia, and that includes students and graduate students, as well as academics, professors, researchers. Many of us function primarily from our intellect. And it's a wonderful thing. We're people of the mind. We love to seek out new topics and learn and cross-fertilize and bring together ideas for new analyses and perspectives. But that means we often neglect what's below our mind, what's below our intellect. We forget that we do have a body underneath. Also, when we do our research, we're always researching humans. We're not researching geology, so we're always researching humans. Humans who lived generations ago, humans who live now. We're researching their ideas, their writings, their actions, their behaviors, their interactions. But we are studying other humans. And it's often interesting how we often disembody ourselves from those humans we're studying. We don't often contextualize those humans who we're studying. Often it's interesting to think about the study of Islam and Islamic spirituality. If you think about the bodies of the people we study, most often they're elite men. And in the process of decolonizing ourselves, we have to realize that we're leaving out a lot of bodies. We often have difficulty accessing, for example, female bodies, female scholars in the Islamic spiritual tradition, because they have not left us a big legacy of writing from the pre-modern period, for example. So when you start to think about the body and our interactions with the body, we start to think about ourselves, our interactions with our subjects, who our subjects are, what's missing, and what we need more of. As teachers, as educators, we teach humans. And I'm going to talk more about this and why, as an educator, something happened during my time as a professor that made me realize the need to teach my students from a humanistic perspective. So this talk really is about how it's okay to bring our full selves into the scholarly spaces and the classroom. And I'm making this argument because I've never been told this. I've always been told that in the scholarly space in the classroom, that's what I am. My other identities have not always been welcome or allowed into those spaces. And I'm here to say that it's okay to bring in these other identities and these other needs and ways of being. So I want to introduce you to myself through my office. Now, I've not been here since December of last year, or January of this, earlier this year, but this is when you come down the religion hall or the humanities hallway in my building at California Lutheran University, you'll find a very colorful little space in the center of the hallway. That's the religion department, and I have the most colorful doorway. And what you'll see is I love domes, as you can tell. So I took out a Saudi Aramco calendar and I posted all their beautiful domes on my door. On the right, you see all kinds of beautiful art projects from my students in my Quran and Islamic spirituality class and exploring Islam class. I have some calligraphy on the left. I have a poster from a Muslim women's fashion exhibit in California. And I have all kinds of pretty little decorations I've taken along my travels. So when you come down to my office, you'll be hopefully greeted with some beauty along your way for my students, for people walking down the hallway. And I find this really important because one thing we're doing as scholars of Islam, as scholars of Islamic spirituality, is we're teaching about these topics. And what's a better way than just to show some of the beauty that comes along with this? So what are some of the things I've actually personally studied as a researcher? I've jumped around in terms of geography, in terms of time period, and what I've been interested in intellectually. I've studied contemporary pilgrimage of people to Rumi Shrine, tourists as well as Muslims. The current book I'm trying to finish up here is the challenges that Muslims face praying in the United States in post 9/11 context. I wrote my dissertation on the development of pilgrimage rituals to Najaf. I know they're very disparate topics, but they actually do go well together when I tell you how. I've been looking at Istanbul at the production and perception of traditional, quote unquote, Turkish art in contemporary Istanbul. I've written papers on what it's like to teach Islam and comparative religions in a Christian university as a Muslim scholar, and lots else. So I've kind of jumped around, but what I've always been interested in is ritual, the body, sacred space. These are intersections that have always interested me. And because of that, I've been especially interested in learning about and studying the body, which is obviously a theme in this talk. As a researcher, as an academic, I've attended the usual guild conferences. I've presented lots of papers. I've attempted to build a decent reputation as a scholar. I worked really hard. I would say I probably overworked to get the elusive tenure. I got funding opportunities, lots of other perks that come with being a scholar, like travel to conferences. Of course, what you don't see is all the rejections, all the failures. I got rejected and declined from so many opportunities along the way. Of course, we don't usually talk about those failures, about the things that we've been declined, all the scholarships, the funding opportunities that, no, thank you, you're awesome, but we don't want you. So I've succeeded in some ways and I've failed in many ways as well because I'm human. But here's what I didn't get along the way. I really was tapping into my masculine side, my masculine energy along the way, is just working through to get everything accomplished, leaving aside my feminine side. What I didn't get is mentoring and support in the academic context for my non-intellectual parts of myself. Encouragement when I failed. Often academia, we're hypercritical, and so we either cover up our failures or we silently feel really awful because we know that sharing failures is not often praised or celebrated. I didn't receive advice to take care of my body and mind equally. I was told that's beautiful to foster intellect. No one ever told me, go do exercise, go do yoga, go meditate, do anything just to take care of yourself. And I neglected my physical body until a few years ago. I was in very bad health and very bad shape. I didn't get acknowledgement of my humanity as a human, a woman, a single mother, a mother, survivor of an abusive marriage, survivor of spiritual and religious abuse. And now this is the first time I'm actually talking about these topics publicly as well, because it's not hard as someone who's an academic to talk about things like being in an abusive marriage, being a survivor of spiritual and religious abuse within the context of Islamic spirituality. So you can see this is a very hard topic to talk about because I not only write and read and teach about these topics, but I've had very positive experiences within these contexts and very, very negative experiences. And it's something that academics do not talk about, unfortunately. What happened in my role as a teacher that changed everything? As you know, the United States has a lot of school shootings and mall shootings. One reason why it's nice to be in Turkey is because it just feels a little bit safer here. In 2017 in Thousand Oaks, California, where my university is located, we had a terrible shooting at a bar and a dance club just down the road from my university. And what happened is that you can see these people were at the club dancing, and this man who was a white man with a Christian background came in and just shot them and injured many other people who were at this club. One of the victims is Justin Meek, and he had been in my class on Islam one semester before the shooting. So it hit us really close. Justin Meek was a really outstanding and really bright student, and many of these people were connected to our campus. And so when this happened, our entire campus went into a shock, into a collective trauma. Now, the shootings happened, and a few days later, you might have heard about the drastic wildfires that also hit Southern California, and specifically Ventura County, which is where my university is located. Thomas Fire came and it devastated a huge area of Ventura County, where many of our students live and our faculty and staff. And then after the wildfires, we had floods too. So we were just devastated by 3 tragedies right back to back. And that's not including brownouts. So can you imagine, I had been at a conference in Canada when the shootings happened. I came back and there I was getting ready to teach another class. But I saw the faces of my students. They were in complete shock. They were numb. I couldn't just teach them as if and pick up where we had left off of before everything had happened. I couldn't do that. My students were in complete shock. Some of them knew the victims at the bar who were killed mercilessly by the shooter. Some of them were living in temporary homes because their home was burnt down. I couldn't just teach them. So what did I do? I started going to Google, right? We always go to Sheikh Google when we need help. I was someone who also had neglected my personal well-being and health at that time. So I didn't really have a lot of resources. So I went to Google and I was like, how do you teach students in a traumatic context? What do I do? And one thing I saw that they recommended is trying mindfulness practices. How do you help someone who is in a state of trauma? Allow them to come to be in the present, to think about, to focus on their breath and not to focus as much on what's going on inside their minds. Now, this was really, I was doing triage at this point. I was like, how can I even just help my students talk about this topic? It seemed so important at the time because all they wanted to do was process this trauma, the grief they're experiencing from 3 back-to-back disasters that happened to us. And so it was a very difficult time. I did bring in various mindfulness practices, but it's at this point, what hit me is that my students are human and I can't just teach them content. I can't just teach them about Islam, about Islamic spirituality. I needed to teach them to their humanity. I needed to work with them to make sure that they felt cared for, that they felt that they were coming to class to learn, but also to learn about their humanity. And so this is the turning point in my own pedagogy, in my own research, in my own personal journey as a scholar and human being, is all these tragedies. So I started to do various practices. I'm at a Christian university. So here I am, a Muslim scholar at a Christian university. We have a chapel. I used to go to the chapel quite often. I actually gave a sermon in the chapel soon after this disaster. We have something called a labyrinth. If any of you have been to churches, we have labyrinths. And so I brought my students to labyrinth. I brought them on educational nature experiences. We used to climb up to the top of our hill near the campus. We used to spend time in our farm area. And I wanted to bring them outside, do experiential walks where they can just notice and observe their environment, their nature, because I found out so many of them, their reaction to trauma was just spending all their time on social media, spending time on their phones, and it was getting them into a deeper and deeper point of despair. Now, I couldn't fix them. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a trauma mental health professional, but I can just do I can do little things to recognize their humanity, to help them learn the regular content I was offering to them in a place that felt safe, in a place where they could be fully human and fully present. Here's a picture of the chapel where I used to take students, Here is me celebrating my tenure with my colleagues. And as you can see, they have, this was Ash Wednesday, so they have the Ash. Almost all my colleagues are ordained in various denominations in Christianity. So it's a very interesting environment to be in where I'm not Christian, I'm teaching about non-Christian traditions, but to be in an environment where my colleagues were often teaching Christian students and also embodying what it means to be a Christian to their students. Now, I had to figure out what does that mean as a scholar of Islam and a Muslim. It was a very different process for me, but I would definitely say my colleagues helped encourage me to think about that process because they were able to embody their various identities because they were obviously in a college and they were in a body and an identity that was part of the mainstream context. And that was much harder for me as the only, at that time, the only Muslim faculty member in the entire Christian university. But it was very useful to have these colleagues who were deeply spiritual in their Christian context. Then I've taught Islamic spirituality numerous times. It's definitely my favorite course to teach. But after these tragedies, I started to change how I taught the course. I started off just teaching the text, the traditional way of approaching the history of Sufism, the various scholars and schools of Sufism and practices of Sufism, etc., like many of us do. But after this disaster, I kept that curriculum, but I also added in some various other assignments and practices to, again, bring in their humanity. And I can't tell you how much this affected the students in a positive way. So one assignment I had is I sent students off. They had to go on a retreat somewhere, be it in nature, be it as a place that was sacred to them. They had to leave their phones in their car. And so they all did it. They all went off for a day without their phones. And it was a very powerful experience. I, again, brought them on walks in nature. I had them sometimes come up with practices to lead their classmates in. Every class, we always started with mindfulness practices. And as we sat and researched and read the work of many pre-modern Sufi scholars, we would sit and ponder it together and really try to understand what it meant to them. And they were especially fascinated by the embodiment that was offered by some of the Sufi scholars. This is what really spoke to them. And so I had them do a creative final project. Oops, there's a picture of me with some of the students. Let me go here first. So this is some of the projects that they came out with. Actually, some of the things I did is I brought in some Sufi leaders. So for example, here's a Naqshbandi sheikh who lived in California who came to speak about his own experience. But my students were fascinated by the body in Sufism. This is where it all comes together. Often in their creative projects, they would talk about the body. They would portray the body in art. For example, here you have a lot of students drew and painted things like this. Obviously, a lot of people are often interested in whirling dervishes in Western context because we know how interesting and exotic it is for many people in the West. But nevertheless, again, this student doesn't know Arabic, but they were so fascinated by the Shahada in Islam, and again, by the presence of God in the body and mindfulness in the body. And I hadn't noticed it until I started putting all these pictures together, how much they really were interested in the physical practice of Sufism. That's what actually interested them in much of the class. Here I had a student who wrote a comic book about Sufism, and I was included as the main character, teaching them about Sufism and Halaj and things of this sort. It was quite interesting. Other things I did in this class, it was kind of accidental. I brought in some Sufi musicians and a whirling dervish. I thought they were just going to perform for my students. But what happened is they actually had my students get up and perform with them. It was quite a shock to me, as you can imagine. I had no intention to have my students participate in whirling practices, as you can see here and here. I was a little bit uncomfortable, keeping in mind the issues of appropriation. But it was the dervish himself, who is a Sufi Muslim, who invited them to participate. I was in shock. But here you have students participating in a zikr with the Sufi group. And I was quite in shock, as many of you can imagine that you would be too, because you had not anticipated bringing your students into practicing zikr and whirling. But the students' reaction to this was incredibly powerful. And so even though I learned that as a scholar, as an academic, we have this big divide between what we teach and what we teach about. What happened here is that the two intersected, and the outcome was really quite positive, even though I was really quite shocked at the same time that my students were asked to participate in Sufi ritual practices. Here we brought the dervish and musicians together in the chapel of our university. And it was really quite interesting. Here you have a statue of Jesus Christ with a well-known in the US Pakistani Qawwali musician and singer group here performing with a dervish. It was something I've never seen before to have this happen. So, and then we all know we've all been in COVID for the past almost 2 years. So we've all been in a situation where we've been in lockdown, right? This is kind of a picture, the documentation of my lockdown. Maybe some of your lockdowns look different, but at this time I was living in Los Angeles for the first 9 months of lockdown. And why I show pictures of the highway is because there was no cars on the highway. And now that is very strange to see no cars in the middle of the day in Los Angeles. It was me and my kindergartner son, and I took a lot of pictures of flowers and cats, but I also struggled a lot trying to deal with teaching online, trying to keep up with my research, trying to keep up with being a kindergartner and then first grade teacher at the same time. I had not signed up for that. I'm sure many of you can relate to that experience. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story, to talk about, again, bring us back to the beginning about the importance of embodying our scholar selves. So where do we go from here? Well, first of all, again, I hold that we as scholars, as humans, as students who are studying Islamic spiritualities and the study of Islam, we need to remember to be in our bodies. And it might sound odd to you to hear this in a talk that is academic, but I want to use this opportunity to remind us that we do need to take care of our physical well-being and be within our body as well as within our intellect. It's really important as we mentor and teach students especially, that we mentor them and teach them through their humanity and through our humanity. It's actually okay to be ourselves. This is something I've learned. For example, if my son happened to have come in at this time, I'd be absolutely fine with it. Whereas in the past, I'd be horrified and embarrassed if my son had walked into the room in an academic talk, making me look unprofessional. Because how can I, as a female academic, possibly introduce a child into this context where all of a sudden my reputation would be lowered? But no, I think having a child is a very normal thing. Many of us have children. And I think if things like this happen, luckily he didn't come in, he's playing Roblox in another room. But if this did happen, it's not as big of a deal as it needs to be. So again, I emphasize that it's very important to keep on with our research and theorizing decolonial Islamic spiritualities, but we also might consider how we can think about our subjects, our students, and ourselves as full human beings. Finally, I think it's important to address very serious issues in academia, and then within the context of Islamic studies. But if you're a faculty member, someone who mentors students, think about how you mentor your students, how you can mentor them as a human being. You can show your human side and also recognize their human side. And mental health is a really important topic that we often neglect in academia. Of course, during COVID, this has become more of an issue, more of a spoken about topic. But I really hope that this is a topic that many more of us can start talking about in the classroom, in our research. It's okay to talk about this in a context like this. Other topics such as spiritual abuse, both within Sufism, because we're talking about the study of Sufism, as well as among people within academia who might adhere to certain spiritual or Sufi groups and who who are known for being abusive to some of their members. And I know this is a very controversial topic, and maybe we'll get some questions about that, but I really wanted to point this out because I know a lot of scholars and young scholars, especially female scholars, who have suffered because of all these issues I'm listing here. And I'm sure they're not the only ones. What I'm talking about here is anecdotal, but I know the power of speaking to people and talking to people from the entire whole being perspective. So how do we get there? Well, what I've shown you in the very beginning of this presentation, of this talk, is taking some time for self-observation, muraqabah, as we call it in Arabic, finding time to be aware of our bodies, to be aware of our mind, and to focus on wellness and well-being of all parts of ourselves, and those in our life as academics. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Very interesting presentation. It's such an important question and set of concerns. I mean, before you came on the scene, Sajjad and I were talking, and I was saying that this is, very, very modern, this diremption, because, in the past, of course, I'm teaching a class this semester. It's called Comparative Hermeneutics of the Self, in which we started with Foucault's Hermeneutics of the Subjects, readings in antiquity about this old, theme, which was essential to the whole enterprise of knowledge, which is epimeleia hoiatu, which means taking care of yourself. That was an absolutely essential part. In fact, it was what it was all about, because knowledge was, of course, tied to salvation. So if knowledge is tied to salvation in this very practical way, so it's not, we are actually Gnostics, moderns, in the sense that we think that simply knowledge will save us. But and I guess in the Muslim tradition, one of the most obvious things about this relationship between scholarly activity and taking care of yourself in a very physical sense is in this old term hakim, which referred, of course, to both a scholar and a philosopher, as well as to somebody who was a master of medicine, directly concerned with the body and dietetics, etc. Meditation, of course, also extremely important to all of these people in the past, scholars, etc. Embodying. Actually, another aspect of the culture of knowledge, which I think is actually runs totally counter to our modern, the way in which our knowledge system is set up in modernity, is this old relationship. And I want to ask you about that. Is this old relationship between faqr, literally poverty. He starts out with this George Makdisi's book, The Rise of Colleges in Islam in the West. As an epigraph, Makdisi has these two quotes from two different scholars, one Muslim scholar and one Christian scholar. One is in Arabic and the other is in Latin. And both of the quotes from the 11th century, and both of the quotes have some common points about what it takes to be a scholar. And amongst the characteristics that coincides in both of them is poverty. So that was actually that was very much the way we live our lives today, scholars. The kind of simplicity and the poverty, literally, that was expected, and it was expected as a necessary condition of knowledge. The way I make sense of that is that, since we scholars strive to be impartial and objective, if you're going to be impartial about the world, the only way to do that is actually to be poor, not to be invested in the world. If you are invested in the world, how are you going to know what the world is worth if you're not going to be able to have a perspective on it? So poverty, that's also something that really runs counter to the entire system of modern knowledge. In fact, in the academy, a lot of the stuff is exactly about our salaries, and if you work in a university where they offer you apartments, etc., lots of competition amongst professors about who gets what kind of apartment. I've seen this a couple of places, or whatever, housing, all of these kinds of things, which are totally bourgeois. Totally bourgeois concerns, and are really quite unique to the modern culture of knowledge. So those are some thoughts that I had while listening to you.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. I love that you brought up the Hakim. And if you look into pre-modern Sufi writings, which I, in earlier years, when I used to focus on that topic, very much it was the Sufi guides and teachers were teaching a combination of the well-being and self-knowledge, which included intellectual knowledge, but also knowledge of the body. Why did they used to send them into cells and Sufi lodges for 40 days and 40 nights? That was a very difficult thing to do physically speaking, but they had to experience that difficulty physically and be present within their bodies and within their minds for 40 days and 40 nights. Can you imagine that? It wasn't just an intellectual journey, but it was also a physical embodied journey as well. But we often forget that, like you said, in the academic context. And I like what you brought up about faqr, about poverty. Exactly, and the university is a neoliberal institution, especially within the United States, because we have so many private universities and so many students now go into debt. I'm not sure what the situation is in Pakistan, for example, but in the US, students take on huge amounts of debt and have to pay off their student loans until they're 60 years old, just in order to receive a bachelor degree, let alone graduate degrees. So it's really quite an interesting path that we all choose to take.
Yes, and of course, I guess in America, only since the early 20th century, of course, the kind of institution you're at is different in this regard, but most institutions, any religious or spiritual thing is considered to not be part of, knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah, so this vast experience.
Exactly.
Yeah, and
exactly.
Keep talking about ethics, but in terms of, so one of the things that the reason I was teaching this course, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that, also as political people, as people on the left, I mean, the kind of trouble that we're in and the kinds of troubles that are coming our way, how are we going to have, because this is something, for instance, in the Marxist tradition, it's as if ethics would just take care of itself. Yeah. Well, but it can't. Ethics can't just take care of itself. How are you going to cultivate strong ethical subjects? How are our students? I mean, I can't even imagine what all they're going to go through in their lives, in the kind of world that has been prepared for them. So we don't actually, as you're trying to do, we don't actually do anything for them to have that kind of inner strength.
Exactly. We're not equipped to offer students preparation for anything that's coming, global warming, who knows, pandemics, wars, whatever that might be.
Fascism.
Yeah.
Yes.
Shall I?
Yes, Sajjad.
Yeah, no, I thank you for that. I think that was very useful. It reminded me of one thing which is quite interesting, which was that, during the lockdown, it was extremely common in a number of schools. So, for example, the school that my kids went to, still go to, in fact, that they would have a bit of time every day set aside for mindfulness and kind of meditation practices. But the idea that we would do that with our students who were teaching online never arose. And in fact, if anything, while we were all very aware that mental health was a big issue and we needed to be much more concerned about our well-being and our students' well-being, the immediate effect of lockdown was to make all of our workloads just crazy, right? So, going from 1 or 2 meetings a week to like a few hours every single day, like last year from April to, I would say, October, when, as Nauman knows, I ended up actually in A&E because I'd had enough. I was probably on meetings like 2-3 hours a day, right? Oh. Now, and that was very common. None of us had a summer last year or this year. And despite the fact that universities, especially research universities, are supposed to consider summer your sacred time for research, that did not happen in most places, right? So I think that is a very important point that we need to concern ourselves with. And you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the fundamental things about decoloniality is this question of position and this question of embodiment and who we are and what perspective we're speaking from and being from. And for that, it seems very odd to even think about teaching about spirituality without some notion of what that actually looks like or what that feels like. It seems very, very strange to even attempt to do that. And certainly, I think we're now at the point where, the very idea of objectivity based on some sort of disembodied set of minds interacting with each other. This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And one wonders what the actual pedagogical justification for such an approach could even be, right? So I absolutely take your point. The well-being one is absolutely central. This is what we really should be dealing with. And we haven't in universities done that at all, either for students or even for colleagues. And I know plenty of colleagues who've suffered greatly. Not just the simple juggling matters, you can't be doing meetings and doing work and teaching, and then you've got like your kids in different rooms also on the computer, and some of them need help with this and that. I mean, it's just, and your Wi-Fi can't deal with it. It's like simple kind of tech issues as well. Yeah. I mean, I think that is a fundamental problem. But alongside that, the bigger problem, which you've already indicated, and this is a problem that often is broached when people talk about decoloniality. And that is that if you have a university which fundamentally is a business enterprise, is a neoliberal enterprise, as you put it, quite rightly, how can that possibly decolonize itself? It's just, I can't even begin to think how that would be possible. So
that's a wonderful question.
If I go, not so much to my dean, because I think he's very sympathetic, but if I were to raise with senior management, issues like, I think we need to bring in mindfulness practices for colleagues and staff, like every single day. We need to integrate it. We need to be much more aware of how the context in which we're living. So, our university has gone back to face-to-face normal teaching as if nothing ever happened, right? And a lot of places have. Most of our teaching is just as if nothing happened. You walk around campus, hardly anyone's wearing a mask, and you're like, oh, so nothing happened. And there's a complete denial, actually, in some ways as well, which I find very, very bizarre. So, the pandemic has changed us, and it's one of many which, as we move forward, the whole question of how in modernity technology changes us is not considered. The one classic response to the pandemic was like, well, let's come up with really cool software and apps to teach in more effective and efficient manners, and using technology and media that people that kids like to use. And you're thinking, well, that doesn't seem to be the most obvious response to dealing with this, because all of those elements of technology are even more kind of disembodying, are even more kind of depersonalizing than anything that we would do in a lecture theatre or in a seminar room. So yes, thank you. I mean, I think that's these sorts of questions of actually reflecting on the self are absolutely central. Even before you can begin to pick up, a text of, Ghazali's or Rosbehan or, Nizamuddin Aulia, etc., which are all deeply embodied texts, right? You need to think about, well, who you are and how you're reading and where you're reading and why you're reading and all these other questions.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of really good points, Sajjad, and I really appreciate your reflection on what I presented today. And one thing I wanted to mention is that as a female professor, I've noticed that students often come to me much more so than my male colleagues. And this goes across the board for all my female colleagues around the US. I'm not sure about other countries, as well as faculty of color. So I find this interesting that they all report, and there's been studies on this, report that students will go to faculty almost as a therapist. I felt like sometimes I've been a therapist for students, and they let out their emotional load onto me, and I usually refer them to counseling, but maybe that's why I became a coach as well, because I realized I had the skills based on all the students coming to me. But some faculty more than others experience the mental load that students are bearing because they're more willing to speak to them than other faculty. But I think what you're asking about, how can we even attempt to work with this issue of this neoliberal university in our capitalist societies? We just do little things that we can make a difference with. This is my philosophy, is I cannot unravel and deconstruct the neoliberal institutions in our society. I have no power to do that. But if I can leave little traces of kindness and humanity behind in my teaching, in my research, in the service I do, then that's all I can really hope to do. I cannot change the system of the universities. Everything has to change. As we've learned during the lockdown, almost 2 months, every single thing in our societies around the world needs to change. It's all basically broken and only serves the people who built the systems. The rest of us have not been served by how our society works. Women, children, people of color, oppressed minorities around the world are not being served by how it is. So we, as our small individual roles, can make small differences, and that's the only thing that I can personally hope to ever work on, and that's the only thing I could ever control. One day, perhaps we can tear apart these institutions, but until then, we can make little differences.
I think even the people at the top need what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, they themselves are broken. Yeah, I mean,
they need it more than the rest of us.
Yeah, they really do. I mean, they're really messed up. Yeah, naturally.
Yeah.
I mean, and you know, some of these. I can't remember the name of the series. It was about this really elite family. Succession, I think it was called. But what a disaster. Yeah, I mean, they live just utterly catastrophic lives. They have no relationships with anybody, no real relationships with anybody. It's really, and this was, you know, within the family itself. It's really monstrous relations that exist within the family itself. I mean, actually, one of the cases that one could make, because, you know, we are also, on top of everything else, living through this kind of cognitive catastrophe. Yeah, thanks to you know, actually, we're on Facebook right now. All these social media, social media themselves have been cognitively just catastrophic. I mean, not just I'm a different person, I think, now today from what I was, I don't know, 15 years ago, because of my immersion in social media. And the kinds of practices that you're talking about, I think are absolutely necessary also to just restore some of the cognitive damage. You know, because obviously without attention, there is no learning. Without I mean, there's no such thing as learning without attention. So, you know, the healing, I mean, speaking of therapy, I mean, philosophy used to be thought of as that was the therapeutic discourse is philosophy or spirituality, because philosophy and spirituality obviously are not two separate things, both of them having to do with wisdom. Sophia is along with Sufi also. Al-Biruni says that he says this is one of the etymologies of the word Sufi is Sophia, wisdom. In any case, that's what it's all about, which is about living well and being well and all of that. So this therapy, we need this, we really need this kind of therapy of attention. Because that's the, I mean, you know, I think that students actually are just not able to pay attention to things.
That's exactly why I brought in some of these practices, because they told me they were able to focus more on the subject matter after these practices as well. And being centered after running from lunch or running from another class really helped them be able to pay attention in class, because as we know, they every year their attention deficit is going up, and they're able to focus less and less on long readings and on long lectures, and anything that needs deep focus is very challenging for people who grew up as native digital social media users, and as well as us people who didn't grow up with it but now are very reliant on it. And our attention has changed, our focus has changed.
I mean, one of the things also you mentioned earlier was this question of abuse. And I mean, in this context, you know, if you ask most academics what what is the central pursuit in what they do, they'd probably say something like academic excellence or scholarly excellence.
Exactly.
And yet most of them will not ask the question at what expense, right?
Exactly.
And often, I mean, you know, we all know examples of this. We all know examples of very senior, huge names in our field who frankly are just not very nice people. You know, it's as simple as that. They are far from being the ideal human mentors. And you know, they may well have produced wonderful monographs or articles, but when you look at the kind of the trail of destruction amongst their students, right? You kind of wonder exactly at what expense has this been. It doesn't mean that we are, you know, we don't think that there should be standards or there should be striving to do the best that you can when you are doing research. But there's got to be some kind of consideration of the other. You know, it's not just, you know, bad mentoring and bad supervision. It's plagiarism. It's, you know, even kind of more explicit forms of abuse. And I just still find it astonishing that we don't actually call it out. And in many cases, it's because a lot of people don't feel they have the power to call that out, right? So again, you know, when you're talking about spirituality, which is about, you know, in a sense, the contentment of the soul, you know, in the face of the real, you know, which you could, in one sense, describe it as, you can't possibly even get to that if you're dealing with all these other issues around you.
Exactly, I received tenure last year, which is why I feel more free to talk openly. But for all the years I was in graduate school, all the years I was working towards tenure, I felt censored. And I still feel censored to somewhat, but at this point, I really have a lot less to lose. So I feel I'm able to openly speak about these issues. My spiritual abuse didn't happen within the context of academia, but I do know, especially female academics who have experienced abuse from academic scholars of Sufism and Islamic studies as they recruited them into abusive Sufi orders, or not abusive Sufi orders, but orders where there was abuse of some of the followers in the group, for example. And I have not heard people calling them out. I've heard some of the survivors calling them out. I haven't heard senior academics. I appreciate you, Sajjad, recognizing this is an issue. And clearly you and most people know about these stories. We know what is going on, but we don't talk about it. But if we have these really treacherous things happening within our academic circles, within the study of Sufism, Islamic spiritualities, this is a problem. I no longer am able to remain silent on the fact that their scholarship is good, so let's just benefit from their scholarship and leave aside the person behind it. You know, this came along with the Me Too campaign, right, which happened a few years ago, and then it touched upon Muslim scholars within the United States and Europe being uncovered and exposed for their various abuse and indiscretions, despite playing the role as a very pious scholar. And so we had the Me Too in the Muslim community, we had the Me Too globally, but we haven't had that Me Too in our field yet. And it's a really hard one because, again, we present ourselves in academic circles at, according to our intellect, our scholarly reputation, and we just don't talk about or acknowledge things that especially some younger academics have suffered through, and perhaps some older ones who haven't spoken out about that. And I really wish we would speak out more about that. I don't want to be the only person shouting out about this, but I think we do need to offer support to those who are victims and survivors of some of these people. And we do need to protect other young scholars from these people and to make sure that we mentor graduate students in a safe environment where they are recognized for their humanity as well as for their scholarships.
Mm. No, I mean, this is precisely kind of the problem, isn't it? In the sense that, again, if I remember one conversation with a colleague who I'm sure both of you know, who once said to me that, you know, we were talking about how you teach, for example, the Quran or Quranic exegesis, or how you teach certain kind of classical texts. And this colleague said to me that they found it quite disturbing doing so because there were certain passages and certain texts which were really triggering for them in the sense that reminded them of trauma. Right now, of course, for many people, when you think about it, how can it be traumatic for someone, for example, to listen to the light verse, or or someone reading some passage from the Ihya Ulumuddin, which on the face of it looked perfectly, holistic and ethically kind of edifying. And yet that's because it reminds them of a context which was far from that, right?
Exactly.
And I think that then becomes a huge, huge challenge, which most of us, I don't think, are even aware of. So as I said, when this colleague said this to me, I was completely thrown. I had absolutely nothing to say because
what you're referring to is trauma-informed pedagogy of being a teacher, or trauma-informed therapy, trauma-informed mindfulness, of whatever you do, be it a teacher or trauma-informed researcher, whatever you do, being aware that certain things you touch upon can trigger past memories of trauma in people. And I know this firsthand for myself and for other people, that there are things that can be triggering. I know many, for example, young Muslim women who cannot read Al-Ghazali, for example, because of his misogyny. To call it outright. I mean, of course, he was a man of his times, and so it's hard to obviously interpret him from the lens of a 21st century modern feminist perspective. But I do know Muslim women who, when they read him, are triggered greatly, and some of them will not read Al-Ghazali, for example, because of the things he's written about women. For example, in Al-Kamiyya As-Saada. And so, yes, trauma-informed pedagogy is essentially one of the things I am calling for. And this would require faculty, professors, academics to undergo various trainings. And this is becoming more common. Among there is more opportunities and resources for trauma-informed trainings in whatever it is we specialize in. And I think this is important. Of course, it adds another burden to overburden faculty. So this is the other challenge of faculty are already overburdened, and we're still going through COVID. In most places, we experience more restrictions than we have before, and also the fear of catching COVID if people are not wearing masks. And so people are already overburdened, and to ask them to add this to their lists of specializations and trainings is also very difficult. So how do we balance the need for trauma-informed pedagogy, the need for bringing our humanity and recognize the humanity of ourselves and our students and other faculty and academics? All of this is not easy, but I suppose the easiest thing we can start with is showing up as ourselves, our full selves. I appreciate you sharing, for example, that you had your children in different rooms on their computers or iPads, balancing school. Like, it's really nice to hear that you were also struggling, like myself, with kids going to school online, with your wife trying to manage all that, you trying to teach as if nothing ever changed. And we can't just do that. Sometimes for me, when I showed students and told them about what was going on in my life during online teaching, and then I just checked in with them every week, I would actually send a little check-in form. And I can't tell you how they responded to that. They were so grateful that I just checked in on them and asked them how they were doing. I would send little notes. I would do the check-in form on a regular basis. And they just wrote effusive thank you notes for doing that, because no other faculty members showed care. They continued teaching as if nothing changed, like you had mentioned, but everything changed. And so I changed my curriculum to be more in tune with where I was at, where they were at, recognizing that nothing was normal. And I don't know if it'll ever be normal again at this point.
I think this, I think this is to repeat a point, but this largely because this is, all of this is considered epistemologically irrelevant. Mm-hmm. All of these, a major philosopher, John Searle, was accused repeatedly of sexual harassment, and eventually, and he's a philosopher. I mean, it's bizarre. So a philosopher is somebody who's supposed to be wise. I don't think that's that anybody has any kind of association with that term anymore. when you think of philosophy, you don't think of wisdom, even though it's got the word Sophia in it, right? And it's because that's the general culture of knowledge now.
Yes, I agree fully with that. And as a female scholar, I'm often on guard because I know that there's so many things have happened under the table and that a lot of women have been unable to speak out publicly. And as a woman, I've been able to hear some stories from friends and women I know, both personally and also in private online forums for women academics, where they tell stories of what's happened. And I'm not surprised by anything at this point anymore about who is involved in these kinds of forms of abuse. At this point, it could be anyone. And it's not just men, it's often, there's also women who can be abusive as well. So the situation is we just need to show care for people around us and make sure they know they can speak to someone who's safe and who will listen to them and who will respond accordingly to protect their interest.
Have we had any questions or any comments coming from Facebook? I don't know.
Questions.
I don't think.
No questions, yeah, up to now. Yeah. Well, that was a really heavy-duty session. Thank you so much. These are very thoughtful presentation and lots to think about and see what we can do in our limited spheres of action as scholars, as teachers.
I mean, I think this is, in many ways, today's session has been absolutely fundamental to what we're trying to do with decolonial Islamic spiritualities, because the whole thing is not just about how we change the way we think, but it's also the way we change the way we do things, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Sajjad.
Practice element of that, and I think that's really important. And this is what is often said, that the problem with post-colonialism as opposed to decoloniality was that it was purely this intellectual, very rarefied intellectual exercise, in French philosophy or something like that. Whereas decoloniality had to really deal with the fact that, yeah, we are humans, we have certain contexts, and we're dealing with certain realities. And not just that we're engaging in some rather nice kind of fanciful ideas, which are impractical. So the practicability of it is extremely important. And I think it's also important to insist that it is practicable. So, these are not just kind of fanciful ideas about practice, which, oh yeah, but it's never going to happen, right? But rather, no, there's absolutely no good reason why we shouldn't do these things.
Yeah.
And I think that possibility and that practicability is something that we really do need to stress. We can do the way we do things.
Yeah, and if people are interested in getting more resources or hearing more about what I've done in the classroom or in my research, I'd be more than happy to field questions. You can just Google my name and find me on my university website or my coaching website. I'd be more than happy to have discussions on this topic if people do want to bring more of this approach into their teaching and other parts of their academic lives.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if there are any follow-up questions later, if people watch this later, then we can certainly take that up. I mean, that's something in a sense we haven't really done with this series so far, is just follow up and anything which, I mean, obviously it's just a question of time, right? No one has like infinite time to deal with everything. But I think if we can find anything which is specifically flagged, then yes, it'd be really good to follow up on that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to be here this evening in Istanbul, between Pakistan and the UK.
Again. And yeah, it's getting dark here now, so it's it's night now here. But thank you once again for joining us. Thank you to everyone else who has joined us as well. And I guess there's nothing left to say from me, but just hope to see everyone again in a couple of weeks for the next one of these, and do take care and be well. That's something I used to say regularly when I was doing things online last year, and we sometimes have forgotten this, but it's still the case. Things have not changed despite the general denial in the public. things, for example, in Britain are still pretty bad. We have a very high number of COVID cases. Thank you again, and hope to see you in better times in the future, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Allah Hafiz to everyone.